Look, in my opinion, Gabi, we are facing a decade of wars in which the economy, the Western style of life will not be sustainable here. We will have to dedicate much more of our resources to the military. And therefore, I suggest that we compare the Gaza war not to the War of Independence, but rather to the Suez War of 1956.
Welcome to the Telos-Paul Institute podcast. I'm Gabriel Noah Bram, the director of the Telos-Paul Institute's Israel Initiative. It's 9 a.m. on Sunday, June 30th, day 267 of Israel's war with Hamas. My guest today is a man who needs no introduction, and so he won't get one, except to say that he's one of the hosts of the Tablet podcast Israel Update, and his name is Gadi Taub. Gadi, who's the other host on your podcast for Tablet? And can you introduce yourself a little bit to our audience in case there's anyone there who doesn't know already who you are?
Yeah, my co-host in Israel Update is Dr. Mike Duran, who is the director of the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East at the Hudson Institute. And I am, I guess, first and foremost, a senior lecturer at the School of Public Policy at Hebrew University, but I also podcast quite a lot. I have a Hebrew podcast called Shomer Saf, Gatekeeper, and Israel Update, and I write for various publications here and in the States.
Okay, terrific. Thank you for joining us. We have a lot to cover today in a relatively brief amount of time because you are a keen observer of the situation, Hamatzav in Israel, the politics of dangerous, dire situation, a tumultuous period we'd like to cover today in Israeli history, starting with the protests against judicial reform some time ago, and then leading up to October 7. I'm wondering if you see any connection between the two, how we got from one to the next, what the first thing was about, these protests against the judicial reforms, and then how it is that October 7 occurs and your views of that day, what led to it, what followed from it, and everything in between from there to here, all in a little under an hour. So we should have enough to discuss in this regard. How did we get from there to here in maybe one of the worst years of Israeli history? We should start with the reforms, I guess, and then, as I say, get to October 7 and its aftermath. What were the reform protests about? What were the reforms that were proposed, designed to do, and why were they so upsetting to some people?
Well, that's a very weighty question. One has to first understand that Israel is not exactly a democracy. In 1977, the old elites lost power when Labor lost the election to Menachem Begin's Likud. And from then on, the old guard of the elites found it hard to resign itself to democracy. And what it did was gradually transfer the powers of decision-making outside of electoral politics and into the bureaucracy and primarily the judiciary. And that met the ambitions of Aaron Barak, probably the most activist judge, to my knowledge, in the world. This is like John Marshall plus Earl Warren to the power of 10. And he began what he called a constitutional revolution in which he created for himself Marbury versus Madison style, the power of judicial review. And then he started enlarging standing before the court. We now have a situation in which any citizen can appeal directly to the Supreme Court about anything the government does. And then he expanded the idea of reasonableness and began to allow the court to strike down legislation that was without a doubt constitutional, but was unreasonable in the eyes of the judge. And these powers and so on and so on. And I won't get into the amazing power that the Attorney General has in Israel to intervene in practically everything that the government does, because the Attorney General is also the legal counsel to the executive. And along with the Supreme Court, they created a situation in which the advice that the counsel or the Attorney General gives to the executive is obligatory. So in a sense, the legal counsel to the government can strike down government actions. And so we gradually became a juristocracy, really, a polity ruled by an uber government of judges. And that was frustrating to the democratic forces, and especially the right, because what happened is that the Supreme Court didn't just become the uber government, it became the leftist progressive uber government, because the left that lost elections entrenched itself in the Supreme Court. And so the need for judicial reform was clearly there, and that was almost universally agreed before Yariv Levin introduced his judicial reform. By the way, he did it fully on my Hebrew podcast. I consider this to be the podcast's greatest achievement, because he did it nowhere else in the Israeli media. He had a short press conference of 10 minutes, but the only place he laid the reform out in full in an hour and 10 minutes was on my podcast. And the reform was actually not that radical, but for the first time, it endangered the control of the Supreme Court over Israel's politics, and therefore seriously endangered the rule of the left by proxy through the courts. And so the elites who are progressive and leftists and are ruling through the court would have none of this. And what they did basically, Gabi, is they started lying and telling Israelis that this is going to be the beginning of a messianic dictatorship. I'm quoting them. This is not an invented term. So a reform intended to return democratic decision-making to Israel's citizens was portrayed as an attack on democracy, and that joined in the public mind. They also, it was not just an argument, it was also a kind of rhetoric which told us, look who is trying to do this, all these dangerous Smotrich and Ben Gvir and all the ultra-Orthodox, all these people are just waiting to pounce on you and end your liberal way of life. And so they managed to whip out, if that's the term, public hysteria, that democracy was in danger of extinction. And so a huge protest emerged, but the protest was not what defeated the reform. What defeated the reform was the reckless attempt of these elites to threaten to tear the army apart in their struggle for the reform. They refuse to call it refusals. They call it stopping to volunteer. But what they did essentially is people in very central posts in the army, in very necessary professions of the army, threatened to not come to their training and so lose their capabilities. But also many of them threatened not to come even in case of an emergency. It turned out it was an empty threat. And when the emergency occurred, all these people rushed back to their duties, but some of them were out of shape and could not perform their duties. And we know that created great harm. And so a very large number of Israelis are not willing to forgive these people, because they think that that it was what invited our enemies to strike on October 7. It probably isn't the only reason, but it according to some of their spokesmen, such as Ismail Hania from Hamas, they said, this is a good time because the IDF is falling apart.
Well, this is a very painful subject, this particular fact about the pilot's refusal or threatening not to show up, insofar as it bears on the contentious question of the responsibility for October 7. For me, to speak personally, this is the hardest thing to accept. The fact that we weakened ourselves. We're not in Switzerland. And instead of accepting the results of an election, we had almost ungovernability going on. Well, we know we're in a dangerous neighborhood. What do you think?
The question of responsibility is very complex. Of course, the government and Netanyahu at its head have responsibility. It's usually not what they are saying is their responsibility, although there are some mistakes there. So let me try and tell apart what they are trying to stick to Netanyahu and what I think Netanyahu needs to answer, as I think he himself acknowledges. What their line is, Netanyahu helped Hamas develop because he allowed the Qatari money to go into the Gaza Strip. Now, if it was a mistake, it was a mistake based on intelligence, and Netanyahu never stopped fighting the armed parts of Hamas, the military arms of Hamas, but he thought, like everyone else, that Hamas also had responsibility for its own population, and that population should be able to sustain itself economically. This is not just the Netanyahu government, it was also the Bennett-Lapid government who allowed this money in. And I don't think that this was the mistake. The mistake was the assumption that all the army and all the intelligence branches shared was that Hamas can be controlled and deterred. And here everyone in our system has responsibility for the idea that we can somehow reach accommodation with Hamas and that we can make do with a defensive posture militarily. We all assumed that Hamas that they would act inside a frame of mind that we recognize in ourselves, in which the well-being of the population is in the end a consideration, even the consideration. And you could hear how cocky the Israeli intelligence was when former intelligence chief, head of Amman, the military intelligence, which in Israel is also responsible for the national intelligence assessment, Tamir Heyman, who is now at the head of INSS, a think tank that is associated with the Democratic Party in the United States, said just before the war, he said that in 2 months, he said, I get a lot of hysterical telephone calls that there's going to be a war with Hamas, he says, but that's all ridiculous. And I don't even have to look at the intelligence, he said, I just have to calculate the interest, and it's not in their interest. So you see, the head of our intelligence doesn't take seriously examining the intelligence, because we are so cocksure that we understand that Hamas are just like us, and therefore, if we were in their place, we wouldn't start a war with Israel because it would be devastating to them. And so the whole of the intelligence apparatus shared that. But also, we were all blind, and this includes the politicians of all stripes. We were also blind to the Iranian plan to eradicate us, which was through building proxies. And we built the wrong army for the challenge, along with the whole West, by the way. And this, of course, includes Netanyahu, too. We thought that high tech beats low tech. And therefore, that the fact that we have a technological edge, that deters our enemies. And what we saw was brilliantly described by my colleague Mike Duran and his colleague at the Hudson Institute, John Kasapoulou, who said this is Star Wars versus Mad Max. And the Mad Max ragtag band of low-tech terrorists have completely outsmarted and overwhelmed our sophisticated defenses. First of all, by duping us, duping our intelligence, and secondly, by using technology that we were not ready for. I remember one Army officer who was stunned, like everyone, by October 7th, said, but we weren't ready for terrorists overground. We were ready for them to come underground. They were not supposed to cross through the fence. So yeah, they were not supposed to do what we expected them to do. And so they surprised us. And now we find ourselves, after many years of believing in technology, with an army that is first and foremost too small. We had this one after the other of our chiefs of staff believed in what they called a small, smart army, and they reduced the armor divisions, the artillery, the manpower, and now we have an army. It was very scary on and around October 7th. We were not ready for a second front, so thank God Hezbollah didn't take advantage of this at the first moment. Now we're much better ready. We're much more ready, but first and foremost, our army was not big enough. And look what has happened. Iran has created a ring of fire, as they call it, around us. And we are now fighting, as Prime Minister Netanyahu has said recently in the Knesset, we are fighting on 7 fronts against Iran. We are fighting in Lebanon with Hezbollah on a relatively controlled level. It hasn't spun out of control to a full-fledged war, but that's one front. Then there is Syria and the IRGC-backed militias there, the IRGC's militias in West Iraq, that's already 3. The West Bank, which Iran is increasingly penetrating, the Houthis in the south, and in Gaza, the Iran-backed Hamas. And the 7th front is now, of course, Iran, which attacked us directly. So we are now dealing with a ring of fire employing low-tech technology. And if you look at what happened the night that we successfully intercepted around 300 Iranian missiles and drones, that was not the victory that Biden asked us to declare. This was very worrying because they used cheap weapons, and Israel alone spent $1.5 billion on interception that night. This is not something we can afford in the long run, and the Iranians have a huge stockpile of these things, and they can afford to go for very long. So obviously, we have to change our strategy and and the war we are getting ready for, and what we saw crucially, we cannot depend for ammunition on the United States, which doesn't want this war with Iran to escalate, and is stopping us from going after Hezbollah at the moment. And Israel is, a high-tech, almost superpower. It can't be that we can't also manufacture bombs.
I was fascinated by your description of the question of responsibility, which is much more nuanced and complex than one hears in the blame game. In light of everything you said about the complexity, do the Israeli people, and I'll have to put it this way, do we as the Israeli people, as a nation, all of us share responsibility, given that I sensed we were all kind of a little too relaxed about our neighborhood. We were the startup nation, and as Jews, we had sort of gone beyond Jewish history. It was the Jewish end of history. We were now beyond all of that we went through in Europe. And I'll give you an example to try to find a point on it briefly. Avigdor Lieberman, I believe, a couple of years ago, raised heck trying to get people to listen to his view that the threat from Gaza was very serious, needed to be dealt with. But Gadi, if Israel would have gone preemptively to stop with the conceptia, to stop thinking that we can use rational choice theory and think of the Hamas as reasonable, or Iran, God forbid, to imagine that they're reasonable. How could Israel have acted differently, decisively, given world opinion and given the Israeli public's, I would say, reticence to have dealt with this more seriously sooner? How could it have been handled, except to acknowledge that the voters have some responsibility, the government's to blame, the leadership class. On the other hand, our enemies on seven fronts bear some responsibility. How about this before we move on? Was the country as a whole, were the citizens also involved? And I ask because, again, one hears so much derogatory blaming of everyone else. And I wonder if maybe there's enough responsibility to go around even for a little bit for each one of us.
Certainly. I can tell you about mine, because the conceptia, the wrong conception that we were enthralled to, or I was initially, is Oslo. The idea that we can have peace with the Palestinians. We've just not been listening. They are not willing to have any Jewish sovereign presence in the land of Israel. They never have. They never agreed to anything. And our idea that we can just live beside them was completely mistaken. So within the framework of the Western way of thinking, that we thought that we can reach some accommodation with them, it is inconceivable for us that people are willing, indeed eager, to die if they can kill Jews in the process. This is a deep religious belief. They're all going to heaven, 72 virgins, what have you. But even the Palestinian Authority, which the Americans are now trying to convince us are more moderate than Hamas, they have a pay for slay program in which you are incentivized to kill Jews. And the more you kill, the more money your family gets if you die. And the more money your family gets, the longer the sentence you serve in an Israeli prison. The whole Palestinian ethos is built around killing us, not around nation building. And so anyone who shared any of these ideas, and I did, as you know, I moved to the right in the last, I guess, more than decades now, but initially I was a supporter of Oslo, and then I supported the misguided disengagement from Gaza because we were just not aware of the fanaticism behind the Palestinian movement. And I had on my podcast a few people who were studying the jihadist movements in the Muslim world, like the Muslim Brotherhood, like the Iranian Shiites. And for them, it's a religious commandment not to be shirked, to destroy Israel and kill every single Jew. It's they read and reread the holy text of the Hadith, where it says that if a Jew would be hiding behind a tree, the tree would call to the Muslim and say, "There is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." And so we have completely ignored this and just assumed that we can get along with these fanatic movements or somehow make peace with them. And our assumption was, and this is how we moved to or adjusted to the post-national globalist trend in the West as a whole, which follows Fukuyama rather than following Samuel Huntington, and realizing that there is a clash of civilizations coming. And so now we are fighting the war of the West against the neo-Nazis of Iran, and only we are fighting it. The West is ignoring it. And you asked about the American administration. The American administration is perhaps the most misguided of all, because ever since Obama, it developed a strategy in the Middle East in which it wants to create a new balance between Sunnis and Shiites, between Americans, America's allies and the Iranians, and they're trying to reach an accommodation with Iran. And they're signaling that all over the Middle East all the time. Since the moment that this administration stepped in and harked back to Obama's doctrine for the Middle East, it has been signaling the Iranians that we are searching for an accommodation. So they took the Houthis out of the list of terror organizations. They stopped selling effective weapons to Saudi Arabia in their war with the Houthis. They did the same with Israel and Hezbollah. The maritime border agreement, which they easily imposed on a very weak government headed by Yair Lapid, was actually a complete surrender to Hezbollah, and Hezbollah viewed it like this. Hezbollah is bragging ever since that it has become powerful enough to extract concessions from Israel without even using the threat of force, never mind actual force. And so Amos Hochstein, the special envoy for the Biden administration, is at this moment trying to force another surrender on Israel, in which we will concede territory in exchange for Hezbollah promising not to approach the border, and America is already promising it money. Of course, it can't transfer money directly to Hezbollah, which is a designated terror organization, but they will give it to Lebanon to reconstruct the south of Lebanon. And who controls the south of Lebanon but Hezbollah? So the general idea that they have is that, look, both administrations, the Trump administration, the Obama administration, both wanted to start pulling out of the Middle East. They just had, as Mike Duran pointed out, opposite philosophies. Obama thought that the problem is that America's allies were dragging it into wars in the Middle East. And so what the United States should do is position itself a little further from its allies and a little closer to Iran, so it can serve as an objective mediator, which the Iranians would also believe. And this is what's behind the JCPOA. The whole JCPOA, the nuclear deal, is actually a deal which would allow Iran to acquire nuclear weapons at the end of this period of time. And at one point, Obama said that in his estimation, by 2028, the breakout time from the supposedly civilian nuclear program to actual weapons would be a few weeks. So they knew that they were handing Iran nuclear weapons. And as you know, the JCPOA has sunset clauses which end it by 2030. At the end of this decade, Iran would have an internationally approved military nuclear program, essentially. So the idea was to create this new balance, which they called regional integration. And this is putting Israel's existence in danger. And so the American administration had to sell it to Israel, and by the way, to the American public, as something else than it really is. The JCPOA was portrayed as a continuation of the successful containment policy of the struggle against communism, the Cold War, and the regional integration policy was sold as something that Israel can live with. And look what we have now. What are they telling us now, the Biden administration? They're saying basically that if we make more concessions to the Palestinians and return to the two-state track, then the Saudis will come around and normalize their relations with Israel, and then we will all create a grand coalition to contain Iran. This is all a blatant lie, because they're not containing Iran. They can start containing Iran now. Trump contained Iran. This is why we had the Abraham Accords. They're dismantling the Abraham Accords using the Palestinians as a bowling ball. They returned the Palestinian veto. And so they're trying to stop the war in Gaza, which they are desperate to portray not as a war by proxy with Iran, but as another round in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so just solve this, and the Saudis will come around. But the Saudis have been deserted by the Biden administration, and they know it. We are being deserted by the Biden administration, and the Saudis know it. Why would Saudi Arabia normalize relations with Israel if it gains almost nothing from it? So we are, and the Israeli press is buying that lie because Israelis, especially on the left, are desperate to reconstruct their Oslo peace dreams, and so they're cooperating with the American attempt to leverage this war to impose on Israel what Israel's citizens, or the majority of them, clearly doesn't want. So we have an elite cooperating with the Americans in order to finish this war without victory, so that a weakened Israel would be easily led by the Americans to concessions that the Israeli public doesn't want.
Is it going to happen? Can Netanyahu,
no, it's not. No, it's not.
Government, they're calling him Mamshelet Huban. There's so much vitriol. I try to tell Americans that Bibi derangement syndrome in Israel is 10 times the hatred of Trump, of TDS, of Trump derangement syndrome.
Yeah, but in a much smaller sector of the population. They're very noisy. But Netanyahu has a majority, and an even much larger majority rejects prima facie the very idea of a Palestinian state. You cannot win an Israeli election if your platform is a Palestinian state. And note, when the Americans started leaking from the State Department that they will unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state, 99 members of parliament voted for Netanyahu's declaration that this is unacceptable. 99 out of 120. This is a supermajority that I've never seen in my lifetime about anything. Maybe peace with Egypt was around that, but I'm not sure. I was just 13 years old back then. And so this idea is anathema to the Israeli public and has no chance. And even the idea that they're trying now to impose a diplomatic solution to the problem of the Lebanon border, and we have about 100,000 displaced persons who have left the north and the Gaza envelope area, and these people are not going to go back home just because we have some piece of paper in which Nasrallah, the chief of Hezbollah, has somehow committed to not getting close to the border. So any Israeli government would face hard limits with the Israeli electorate, will not accept a Palestinian state. Any government that would try to go back to the Oslo frameworks will encounter the fury of an Israeli public who doesn't think that the Palestinians deserve a prize for October 7th.
Can Israel win now? Will Israel win? Does the Israeli public have the will to win? There's the issue quite well. Of the hostages, the hostage families. There's protests, rather large protests about a very painful subject. We all feel for the hostage families. You'll hear people in the press, for what it's worth, raising doubts about Israel's chances of success, and does the public have the will to win in Gaza? And what about the north?
Absolutely, yes. Netanyahu has been saying, look at what he did from the beginning of this war. All the noises, all the voices, all the pressures, American internal, the families of the hostages. By the way, these are not the family of the hostages. These are some of the families and some very cynical manipulators who are behind the demonstrations of the so-called the Committee of the Families of the Hostages. I have nothing bad to say about the families of the hostages themselves. I can't imagine what pain they are going through, but there are cynical manipulators behind these demonstrations, which are not helpful to returning the hostages. They are blaming the Israeli government for not doing enough to return the hostages. And this only creates a situation that rewards Yahya Sinwar staunch refusals. Why would he concede anything if he can see that there is internal pressure on the Israeli government to make more concessions? And the Americans are making the same mistake. The Americans are desperate for a deal, but they're working basically against it. So these people, I refuse to sympathize with the cynical manipulators who are pretending to speak for the hostages. They do not speak for the hostages. They are making it harder to return the hostages. But also the press is overwhelmingly on the left, and it shares the plan that I just described to you, to the belief that a weakened Israel will be more malleable and more susceptible to American pressure, and then we will go back to the two-state solution. So there's a lot of noise, but the soldiers have no doubt. Anyone returning from the front says that all these arguments sound crazy when you are in Gaza. They call themselves the generation of victory. One of their slogans is "Lo noflim midor tashach," no less than the generation of the War of Independence. And Israelis generally understand that this is a war for survival, and we have no other choice but to win it or else perish. And so the Israeli public, I think, will gradually accustom itself to a lot, because we will look, in my opinion, Gabi, we are facing a decade of wars in which the economy, the Western style of life, will not be sustainable here. We will have to dedicate much more of our resources to the military. And therefore, I suggest that we compare the Gaza war not to the War of Independence, but rather to the Suez War of 1956. Remember the sequence. In 1955, the Egyptians struck an arms deal with the Soviets, which threatened to tip the military balance in the Middle East in their favor. Nasser was then the leader of the Arab world, and his pan-Arab movement was supposed to unite the Arab world into basically one nation state, which would surround us, and then in the end throw the Jews into the sea, as was the slogan in the Arab world back then. So a noose was being created around us, and we had to break it. And it took 4 wars and a political sea change. The War of Suez, the War of Attrition, the 6 Days War, then the War of Attrition, 67 to 1970, this 1973 Yom Kippur War, and then the change of government in Israel and the change of the climate internationally, which led to the peace accord in 1971, so in 1979. So it's basically 24 years, almost a quarter of a century, that it took us to break the noose that Nasser was constructing around us. Now we woke up and found ourselves already encircled in a noose that Iran has been constructing around us. And this is, I should say, not the first, but the second war against Iran, although the first time around we were less aware of it. In 2006, we had a war with Hezbollah, which is a proxy war with Iran. Now we have the second war with Iran, which is the Gaza war, and most probably the third war with Iran is going to be the war with Hezbollah. We cannot acquiesce to this Nazi monster on our borders, 10 times stronger than Hamas, and capable of paralyzing this country with something around 150,000 rockets, many of them much more precise than the weapons that Hamas have. This war will be worse in terms of casualties than any Israel experienced ever. So this is going to be the third war with Iran, and I regret to say probably not the last. So we are facing a very difficult period in which Israel's very survival is on the line. And if you permit me to make a sociological prediction before we end, it's in my opinion, all these protests and all this peace movement and all this the silly appeasement press and all that, this is going to we say ketzef alamayim. How would you say foam on the
on the waters,
on the waves?
On the waves, you could say on the waves, yeah.
Yeah, it's just the crest of a huge wave that the crest would disappear because the existential threats to Israel's existence are gonna make everyone dispel their illusions, and it's a serious reality check.
Given this decade of war that we appear to be embroiled in, that you foresee on the horizon, what about Israel's status in the international community? Israel is considered now a pariah. Is that correct? And what about Israel's most important ally and the coming elections? Does it matter who's in the White House concerning Israel's chances of fighting this existential war that you described? What about Israel's reputation? And does it matter who wins in 2024 in the U.S.? Is Trump better for Israel? Is Biden?
I think it matters a great deal. I think Trump's policy cannot be. I can't fathom appeasement of Iran. Whatever his thoughts on Israel are, and the fact that he's unpredictable is also something we should take into account. But he will not. I can't see him adopting this progressive frame of mind in which you grovel at the feet of your enemies. It's just it runs contrary to anything that he stands for. So this is a great concern. But we should remember that any American administration may be retreating from the Middle East, and we have to diversify our alliances, and we have to work with the American administration, whichever that would be. We can't go directly against it, but I think that we can. Suppose that that Biden or whoever the Democrats put in his stead wins, we still have room for maneuver, and I hope that this would start already now. Benjamin Netanyahu is scheduled to give a speech before the joint session of the two houses of Congress, and I hope that what he will do there is what he began to do in his speeches here, and call it a war with Iran. The administration is desperate to isolate this from Iran, but it also cheats the American public. The American public is not aware of the extent to which the United States is forcing Israel to acquiesce to its disastrous appeasement policy, or trying to force Israel to acquiesce. So they're pretending to be our great friends. They always say no administration has been so supportive of Israel, which is a BS. Their policy runs directly against our most vital interests, and calling them on it would be, I think, effective. We saw Netanyahu do this with the weapon shipments. The American administration is withholding arms from Israel, and Biden is lying when he's saying it's just one shipment of 2,000-pound bombs or whatever he said. They are slow walking all ammunition since January in order to prevent us from making long-term plans, such as plans for a war with Hezbollah. And they kept saying that that's not true. They're not withholding the ammunition, and they're pretending to be in our corner publicly. And what Netanyahu did was very effective. He said, "You're saying this publicly, but that's not true." And lo and behold, what happened? The minute he called them out on it, they started to fast track the shipments that were being withheld. So I think most probably Netanyahu is not going to do the same thing vis-a-vis the general Iran policy of this administration. The American public would be shocked and appalled to discover that the Biden administration is groveling at the feet of the Ayatollahs. It doesn't like the Iranian fanatic Nazi mullahs, and it does love Israel. So Obama's policy had to be sugar-coated. The Biden's policy has to be sugar-coated. And if we break the sugar coating, then I think we can embarrass them greatly. And, Gabi, in the long run, one should hope that the West is waking up to see that Iran is a danger to the whole world. And maybe their friction in the West, in Europe, in the United States, with the growing radicalism of anti-Western forces, would also bring people around to see that Israel is fighting America's war. It's fighting Europe's war against jihadist, genocidal, anti-Western, misogynist, homophobic, racist forms of Islamic jihad.
As you sketch this situation regarding America, I wonder if you would comment on the scene at the American college campus. I'll just frame it this way to echo what you just said. There's a cartoon you may have seen of lots of people, like a whole mob, a mass of little cartoon figures, and one lone figure standing against them saying, "Yes, you are wrong." And that figure holds an Israeli flag. If Israel is fighting for civilization against barbarism, and civilization doesn't seem to know it, and one of the places where civilization is supposed to reproduce itself, not the only one, I don't want to overstate it, is the American college campus. What's your assessment of this sector of society inside of Israel's chief ally? How can public opinion among young people and thought leaders be so skewed and uncomprehending of the realities?
Yeah,
and what does it do for Israel if this?
My hope is that most Americans hate what they see on campuses, as most Americans hate, the radical trans ideology and the idea that children can change their sex without their parents knowing at the age of, 12 or something. So I trust the healthy moral instincts of the American public and not the deranged elites, which I hope will gradually lose power. And we had good news this week when we learned that Harvard and I think MIT too were changing their diversity, equity, admission policy. So hopefully these people will start realizing it. But we now have to fix 40 years or more of postmodernism and Edward Said, and perhaps everything since 68. So some people realized already, I mean Alan Bloom and others, that the universities are maybe lost, and we need to start creating other institutions. I know I have a friend who's a journalist in New York City. He's a Jewish guy, and he said, I'm going to forbid my children to go to college. They're not going to go to college because this is a corrupt, immoral, anti-patriotic, anti-Judeo-Christian ethos that they are inculcating in our youth there, and we should just resist. So I hope people are going to wake up and start fighting back. And my optimistic take from the nights of the debates is, I don't know that the Republicans, Trump is going to win the election. I don't know if Biden would be the nominee after the convention. I don't know any of that, but I think that the big thing that happened is many more people are realizing that they have been consistently lied to, I think Barry Weiss wrote, and I think she's not a supporter of Trump, right? And she wrote, it's one of those rare moments where so many masks fell off and so many lies were called out and so many liars were called out. Hopefully, we will stop believing the lying leftist progressive media. If that happens, then we've made great progress.
You gave a talk for the Telos-Paul Institute on post-journalism not long ago, and I want to point our listeners to that talk. It's on our YouTube channel if they're hearing you now and they want to learn more about your analysis of post-journalism, I think you call it. And just now you made the point very firmly that this well, what Louis Althusser would have called ideological state apparatus, but that takes us back to our postmodern days in graduate school. Yeah. This organ of deception. As we conclude, you've been studying post-journalism for a while. You gave a talk for TPPI on this. Would you elaborate a little more or suggest what we should understand about this concept as it's known, post-journalism?
The concept was coined by Andre Mir, the scholar of journalism, and what it basically says is that when the press shifted from a financial model in which it was selling audiences to advertisers, basically, and therefore needed a diverse press organizations in order to reach varied, different, larger crowds, then a lot of the press in the age of the internet moved to a subscription model, and the subscription model turned the press organizations into narrower, more ideological organs. And we used to think that this is because people who pay subscription like to hear their opinions affirmed. But what Andre Mir says is it's not just that. They pay in order to have their opinions promoted. And so therefore they are inhospitable to diverse viewpoints. And you can't have Tom Cotton suggest that the army would be used to pacify riots, because you can't let the other side have any voice at all, because your subscribers are paying you to promote another point of view. So you can't, so they won't pay you to promote Tom Cotton's point of view. And the result is that there is no serious challenge to the various points of view, and they're all talking inside their echo chambers, and so losing touch with reality.
Okay, well, Gadi, you've been very generous with your time and your expertise. Perhaps we'll catch up with you again in a year or so, see where we're at then. Thank you. Thank you very much. And lo noflim medor tishach. Let's not fall below the valor and the courage of the founding generation of 48.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Gabi. Thanks for having me.